Have you ever listened, not just to the wind, but to what it might be trying to say? On the quiet banks of the James River, where trees now stretch undisturbed, and vines curl gently around stones no longer named, there once stood a settlement, a place of hope, fear, and long-forgotten prayers. Jamestown. It was the year 1607 when the first settlers arrived from England. They built wooden homes, stood watch by torchlight, and carved their survival into the soil with every breath. But tonight, there are no settlers, no torches, no footsteps, only silence and something else. Each night, as dusk folds into night and the fog begins to roll in from the river, the people of nearby towns say they hear it. A bell, a single, heavy bell ringing softly through the mist. Its sound is not loud, nor urgent. It is slow, deep, and filled with something that cannot be named. Some say it's just the wind catching on old iron. Some say it's imagination. But the old woman who lives closest to the ruins, the one whose windows face the ancient stones, she says something different. She says the bell tolls for someone still waiting. Her name is Clara Mayweather, and she is 81 years old. She's lived her entire life just half a mile from the Jamestown ruins. Her cottage smells of cedar and old paper. Her hair is white, and her voice is soft, like a lullaby long remembered. Every night she makes tea at exactly 8:15. She sits by her window, wrapped in a quilt stitched by her mother, and when the wind begins to rise and the river fog begins to creep in, she listens. Sometimes she closes her eyes. She knows the sound by heart now. It's not a bell, she told a curious visitor once. It's a memory, shaped like a bell. Many years ago, Clara's grandfather worked as a caretaker at the site before it became a protected landmark. He used to tell her stories when she was just a girl, stories of voices in the trees, shadows that never seemed to match the angle of the sun, and yes, of course, the bell. Back then, she used to laugh. Now, she listens. The bell always rings 3 times, never more, never less. Once at 9:03 p.m., again at 9:17, and the last at 9:33. It's always the same, even when it rains, even when snow falls, even when no one is listening. The bell rings. One summer evening, a young historian named Elijah Cormack came to stay in Clara's village. He had been studying Jamestown's forgotten records, not just of the colony itself, but of what came after: the collapse, the illness, the starvation, the silence. He had read of a church built near the heart of the settlement, with a steeple that held a bronze bell brought all the way from England. But the records say it cracked in the fire, that it melted, that it never rang again. Still, Clara insisted, so he stayed. That night, at exactly 9:03 p.m., as they both sat quietly by the window with tea growing cold in their hands, the sound came. Distant, muffled, but unmistakable. A bell, one clear, soft toll that seemed to echo not through air, but through something older. Elijah turned pale. Clara smiled faintly. "Now you've heard it," she said. And then she said nothing more. In the days that followed, Elijah grew obsessed. He walked the ruins from sunrise to dusk. He searched for iron, for mechanisms, for hidden hands. But he found nothing. Only the ruins, only the trees, only the wind that came like breath through time. One evening, Elijah found an old journal buried under collapsed stone near the church's foundation. Its pages were burned at the edges, but one passage survived. In careful script, it read, "We are still here, though no one comes. The bell must toll for the soul that has not left." Elijah stared at those words long into the night. He did not sleep. That was 6 months ago. And now, every night, Clara still sits by the window. The bell still rings, and the wind still whispers words too soft to understand. But the village is no longer silent about it. Children speak in hushed voices. Dogs refuse to go near the ruins. And some say that on certain nights, when the moon is low and the river is high, a figure walks near the old church, not with feet, but with memory.
The sun had already slipped below the trees, leaving behind only a faint orange glow above the river. Clara sat at her window, as she always did. But tonight, Elijah did not join her. He was at the ruins. He had gone there alone. The village had warned him. The pastor, the grocer, even the children. "Don't go after dark," they whispered. "But why?" he had asked. They never gave a reason. They only looked at him with eyes that seemed older than they should be. 9:03 p.m. The bell rang. Elijah stood by the stone foundation of the old church, flashlight flickering in his hand. There was no bell in sight, no tower, only collapsed stones and twisted roots. Yet, still, the sound came, as if it echoed from beneath the ground. He felt it more than he heard it, like a hum in his bones or a memory he had never lived. He took a deep breath and stepped onto what remained of the stone floor. Moss had grown in patches, and cold air clung to the surface like forgotten breath. He walked slowly. In the middle of the ruins there was a depression, a sunken space where the altar once stood, and behind it, half buried in earth, he saw something, a smooth piece of bronze, cracked but whole. He knelt down and brushed the soil away with shaking hands. Yes, it was the bell. Not melted, not missing, just buried, as if hidden. He touched its surface gently, and in that moment, the wind stopped. The forest, the river, even the insects, everything fell silent. Only Elijah's breath could be heard, and then the second toll. 9:17 p.m. But this time, it rang from beneath him. He fell backward, startled, eyes wide. The bell had not moved. No wires, no ropes. Yet it had spoken again. He stared into the darkening sky, unsure whether he had found something or something had found him. Back in the cottage, Clara's tea had gone cold. She closed her eyes, as she always did, and whispered under her breath, "The second toll means someone has seen the truth." She said it like a prayer, like a memory. She had said it before, but only once, when her grandfather died. Elijah stayed at the ruins long after the second bell faded. He sat beside the buried bronze, unsure if he felt fear or wonder. The journal he had found earlier was open beside him. He read the same line over and over. "We are still here, though no one comes. The bell must toll for the soul that has not left." 9:33 p.m. The final toll. This one was different. It echoed through the trees. It shook the loose stones. It seemed to call, not for someone, but to someone. And for a moment, Elijah felt warm. He didn't know why, but tears filled his eyes. The sound wasn't frightening. It was lonely, like someone who had waited too long to be remembered. He picked up the journal and turned the page, and there, in faded ink, was a new passage he hadn't seen before. "If the bell rings for you, you must answer, or you will stay." That night, Elijah returned to Clara's home, pale and quiet. She didn't ask what he saw. She only poured him warm tea and placed the quilt over his shoulders. After a long silence, she spoke. "Now you've felt it, haven't you?" Elijah nodded slowly. Then, after a pause, he whispered, "Who is the soul that hasn't left?" Clara didn't look at him. She only stared out the window. And softly, almost to herself, she replied, "There are some names the wind remembers when people forget." That night, Elijah dreamed of a woman in an old black dress, standing in the ruins, holding a candle. She did not speak, but she pointed to the bell. When he awoke, the sound of the wind through the trees was soft, almost like someone breathing, and though it was morning, he could still hear, just faintly, a bell.
Like a dream you can walk inside. The next morning came with heavy clouds. The river looked darker than usual, and the gulls circled low, as if expecting rain. Elijah stood at the window of the guest room in Clara's cottage. He had not slept much. The dream of the woman with a candle lingered in his mind. Her eyes had been calm, but urgent. Her lips had moved, but he had heard no sound. And yet, he was certain she had said a name. He just couldn't remember what it was. Clara was in the kitchen, moving slowly, her hands steady as she poured tea into 2 cups. "You've been marked now," she said softly, without turning to look at him. Elijah frowned. "Marked." Clara nodded. "The bell doesn't ring for everyone. When it does, you carry it with you, even when you leave." They sat at the small wooden table. The tea was warm, but Elijah barely touched it. "I found the bell," he told her. "Half buried, cracked, but still there. My grandfather always said that the bell was buried to keep it from ringing. But some things don't stay quiet." That afternoon, the rain began. The ruins of Jamestown blurred under the silver curtain of falling water. Elijah walked there anyway, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The bell waited, half hidden in the ground. its bronze surface wet and shining under the rain. He stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of water against the trees. No bell, no wind, just rain. And then, faintly, from somewhere deeper in the ruins, a voice. Not loud, not close, but clear enough to make him turn. It was a woman's voice, singing, a slow, gentle hymn, in words he could not understand. He followed it. Through the grass, over the broken stones, past the hollow outline of the church walls. The voice led him to a cluster of old gravestones, most too worn to read, but one stood taller than the rest. Its surface was dark and smooth, the letters deep enough to survive centuries. He brushed the rain away and read, Eleanor Grace Whitmore, 1590 to 1610. The bell shall keep her safe. The name stirred something in him, a whisper in the back of his mind. Was this the name from his dream? The name the woman had tried to speak? As he stared at the stone, the rain slowed, and the air grew unnaturally still. And then, as suddenly as the rain stopped, the air grew unnaturally still. And then, without warning, the first toll of the night came. 9:03 p.m. Elijah looked around, confused. It was still daylight. The bell had never rung before dark. The sound was not like the night before. It was sharper, closer, almost as if the bell had been struck just beside him. And with it came something else, a faint smell of smoke and the feeling that someone was standing behind him. Slowly, he turned. She was there, the woman from his dream. The candle in her hand burned without flicker, even in the damp air. Her dress was black, her hair pale, her eyes endless. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. And then, in a voice as soft as the falling rain, she spoke. Do you hear it now? Elijah could not answer. She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. The bell calls those who remember, and those who are willing to answer. He felt a chill move through him, but not from fear. It was something deeper, like standing at the edge of a truth too big to understand. And then, as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. The rain began again. The world returned to its familiar sound. But Elijah knew what he had seen was not a dream. He walked back to Clara's cottage in silence. And that night, when the bell rang at its usual time, he no longer counted the tolls. He simply listened and waited, because now he wanted to know what would happen if he answered.
The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy. The ground was soft underfoot, and the James River carried a brown, restless current. Elijah woke before sunrise. He sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the distant rustle of the trees. The dream from the night before clung to him. The woman's eyes, the steady flame of the candle, the sound of her voice. When he went into the kitchen, Clara was already there. She was stirring a pot on the stove, the smell of porridge filling the small room. Without turning, she said, "You saw her." Elijah froze. "You mean
Eleanor? Clara nodded slowly. My grandfather called her the keeper of the bell, said she was the one who stayed when the others left. Elijah sat down across from her. She spoke to me. She said the bell calls those who remember and those willing to answer. What does that mean? Clara finally looked at him. Her eyes seemed to hold both kindness and warning. She whispered, "It means the bell isn't just a sound. It's a doorway." That afternoon, Elijah returned to the ruins. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the broken stones. He made his way to Eleanor's grave. It was quiet here, a different kind of quiet than the rest of the site, as though the air itself was holding its breath. He knelt by the headstone and traced the letters with his fingers. Eleanor Grace Whitmore. From his satchel he took the burned journal. He turned to the page where the strange new passage had appeared before. Now there was another line beneath it, one he swore hadn't been there yesterday. When the third toll comes, follow the path that is not there. Elijah sat back, reading the words over and over. The third toll. That was always at 9:33. He decided to stay until then. The first toll came as the light began to fade. 9:03 p.m. The sound was low, deep, and somehow inside him. The second toll followed minutes later, 9:17 p.m. This one seemed to make the shadows shift, stretching longer than they should. And then the third, 9:33 p.m.
But this time, it did not fade. It grew, layered, as though a second bell had joined it, then a third, until the air was filled with a chorus of bronze voices. Elijah stood, heart pounding. He looked around, and then he saw it. Between two trees, where there had always been only undergrowth, there was now a path, narrow, dark, lined with stones half buried in moss. It hadn't been there before, he was certain. And yet, it waited. The bell kept ringing, pulling him forward. Step by slow step, he followed. The path wound deeper into the woods, until the ruins and the river were far behind. The air was cooler here. The moonlight barely touched the ground. And then he saw her, Eleanor, standing at the end of the path, her candle steady in the still air. "You heard," she said softly, "and you came." Elijah could only nod. She stepped aside, revealing a small clearing behind her, and in the center of it, another bell, smaller than the one in the church ruins, but whole. Its surface glowed faintly, as if lit from within. "This," Eleanor whispered, "is the bell that answers." Elijah stepped closer, the ground soft beneath his boots. He reached out, but before his fingers touched the bronze, Eleanor's voice stopped him. "Once you ring it," she said, "you can never unhear the answer." Her eyes held his for a long, silent moment, and then she smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried both welcome and warning. Elijah looked at the bell, his breath slow. Somewhere far behind him, in the ruins,
the old church bell gave one final, distant toll, and the night seemed to lean closer.
But this time, it did not fade. It grew, layered, as though a second bell had joined it, then a third, until the air was filled with a chorus of bronze voices. Elijah stood, heart pounding. He looked around, and then he saw it. Between two trees, where there had always been only undergrowth, there was now a path. Narrow, dark, lined with stones half buried in moss. It hadn't been there before, he was certain, and yet it waited. The bell kept ringing, pulling him forward. Step by slow step, he followed. The path wound deeper into the woods until the ruins and the river were far behind. The air was cooler here. The moonlight barely touched the ground. And then he saw her, Eleanor, standing at the end of the path, her candle steady in the still air. "You heard," she said softly, "and you came." Elijah could only nod. She stepped aside, revealing a small clearing behind her, and in the center of it, another bell. Smaller than the one in the church ruins, but whole. Its surface glowed faintly, as if lit from within. "This," Eleanor whispered, "is the bell that answers." Elijah stepped closer, the ground soft beneath his boots. He reached out, but before his fingers touched the bronze, Eleanor's voice stopped him. "Once you ring it," she said, "you can never unhear the answer." Her eyes held his for a long, silent moment, and then she smiled. But it was the kind of smile that carried both welcome and warning. Elijah looked at the bell, his breath slow. Somewhere far behind him, in the ruins, the old church bell gave one final, distant toll, and the night seemed to lean closer.
The storm had passed by morning, leaving the air damp and heavy with the smell of wet earth and river water. Mist clung low over the ruins, as if the land itself wished to hide what had happened during the night. Samuel emerged from the small cabin where he had taken shelter, his mind still replaying the strange, muffled toll of the bell he had heard before sleep claimed him. He walked slowly through the silent streets, his boots sinking slightly into the soaked ground. Every brick, every splintered beam of the old Jamestown church seemed darker, heavier, as though the rain had soaked not just wood and stone, but memories. At the base of the church's leaning tower, Samuel stopped. The bell rope hung motionless, dripping with water. Above, the bell loomed, silent now, its surface dark with centuries of age. He ran a hand along the rope. It was rough, worn thin in places, but dry to the touch. That made no sense. Everything else was soaked. The rope should have been wet. Samuel's heart beat faster. He looked around, half expecting to see someone in the mist, but the square was empty. Only the faint sound of water dripping from rooftops filled the air. He made his way toward the edge of the old settlement, to a part of Jamestown where the outlines of homes were only depressions in the earth. Here the wind whispered through tall grass. The ground was uneven, dotted with fragments of pottery and brick. He knelt, picking up a shard of porcelain, blue and white, the edge of what had once been a delicate teacup. As he turned it in his fingers, A strange sensation washed over him, as though the air had thickened, and then he heard it.
Not the bell this time, but the faint murmur of voices, laughter, footsteps on wooden planks, the clink of metal cups. Samuel straightened quickly, his eyes scanning the mist. Shapes were moving, faint, like shadows at the edge of vision. A man in a broad hat carried a sack over his shoulder. A woman in a long dress stooped to pick something from the ground. None of them looked at him. He stepped forward, but as he did, the figures dissolved into the mist. The voices faded, leaving only the soft rustle of grass in the breeze. Samuel rubbed his temples, wondering if he was losing his mind. But deep down, a thought settled in his chest like a stone. He wasn't imagining these things. Jamestown wasn't as empty as it seemed. Back at the church, he climbed the narrow, crumbling steps of the tower. Each step groaned under his weight, and fragments of plaster flaked away under his fingertips. When he reached the top, he stood before the great bell. Its surface was mottled with green from centuries of weather, but there was something carved into the metal, words he hadn't noticed before, worn and faint. He leaned closer, tracing the letters with his fingertips. "Let the living remember." The phrase was barely legible, but it sent a chill through him. The bell wasn't just a relic. It was a message, a warning, maybe. Samuel stood there for a long while, staring out over the mist-covered ruins. Somewhere far below, he thought he heard the faint creak of a rope tightening. The bell swayed, just slightly.
The air around Jamestown seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Emily had now been in the abandoned settlement for over a week, and the strange rhythm of the midnight bell had begun to seep into her very bones. Every night, when the deep toll rang out across the silent ruins, it no longer startled her. It was as if the sound had woven itself into her heartbeat, steady, patient, inevitable. On the 7th night, she sat by the old church steps, her lantern glowing softly against the stone. The moon was high, casting silver shadows through the broken windows. She thought of all the sermons that might have been preached here, the hymns that might have risen to the rafters, and the prayers whispered in the darkest hours. But she also thought of fear, the fear of those first settlers, surrounded by an unfamiliar land, clinging to their faith like a lifeline. She turned her eyes toward the bell tower. It stood tall against the night sky, its frame worn and splintered, yet somehow still proud. The bell itself was just a shadow in the darkness, silent now, waiting. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by a faint rustling behind her. She froze, holding her breath. The sound grew louder, slow, deliberate steps crunching against dry leaves. She turned her lantern toward the noise, but the light revealed nothing except the shifting mist. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. No answer, only the stillness of the night. She sat for a while longer, trying to calm her racing heart, but then she noticed something, a glimmer of light far off among the trees. It flickered gently, almost like the flame of a candle. Without thinking, she stood and began to follow it. The path was uneven, littered with stones and fallen branches, but she kept moving toward that faint, glowing point. As she drew closer, she realized the light was not floating in the air. It was coming from a small, weathered cabin half hidden in the woods. The door stood slightly open, and inside, she could hear the faint crackle of a fire. Emily stepped in cautiously. The cabin smelled of old wood and smoke. On a table in the center of the room lay an open book, its pages yellowed and brittle. She leaned closer, her fingers tracing the faded ink. It was a journal. The handwriting was careful and elegant, the kind she had seen in letters from the early 1600s. She began to read, "The sickness has taken 3 more today. We have little food left. The nights grow colder, yet still, at the appointed hour, I ring the bell, so that they will know they are not alone." Emily's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the voice of the one who had tended the bell. She turned another page. "If I should fall before this colony is saved, may this bell toll on, a voice in the silence. May it guide them home." The fire in the hearth popped softly, the warmth brushing her face. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a sadness so old and heavy it seemed to come from the walls themselves. And then, as if in answer to the words she had just read, the distant sound of the bell began to toll. Once, twice, slow, mournful, echoing across centuries. Emily stood frozen. But this time she wasn't afraid. She felt invited. The sound was calling her back to the church. The night after the storm was eerily quiet. No wind, no rustling of leaves, only the soft lapping of the James River against the muddy banks. Jonathan sat at his desk in the small room of the old caretaker's cottage, lantern light flickering over the worn pages of his notebook. He had written every detail from the past few nights, the bell tolling, the shadowy figures, and the way the air seemed to grow colder when the sound came. But tonight, there was something else, an urgency in his heart that would not let him rest. Earlier that day, he had received an envelope under his door. No one saw who delivered it. It was old, the paper yellowed, and the ink smudged. Inside, there was only a single line written in elegant handwriting. "When the 7th toll rings, follow the light in the nave." Jonathan didn't know whether to take it as a threat, a warning, or an invitation. But deep down, something told him it was a calling. By midnight, the fog had rolled in thick over Jamestown. The church stood dark, its broken windows like empty eyes staring at him. Jonathan stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. He held his lantern high, its warm glow pushing the shadows back just enough to see where he walked. And then the bell rang. Dong! It echoed through the ruins, vibrating in his chest. 1 toll, 2 tolls, 3. By the 7th toll, he stood in the middle of the nave, the central space where the congregation once gathered centuries ago. At first, he saw nothing. Then, from the far end near the altar, a faint golden light began to shimmer. It was not lantern light, not moonlight. It had a soft, almost living glow, as though it pulsed gently, in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Jonathan stepped closer. The air grew warmer. Strange, since the night was bitterly cold.
The light seemed to hover just above the ground, and as he approached, it began to stretch upward, forming a shape. A woman. Her figure was translucent, her gown flowing as though caught in a breeze he could not feel. Her eyes were full of sorrow. She spoke, her voice carrying an ancient sadness. "The bell rings for those who never returned." Jonathan's breath caught. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. But before she could answer, the light around her began to fade. The bell tolled once more, deep and mournful, and she vanished, leaving only the cold emptiness of the ruined nave. Jonathan stood frozen. He knew now this was not just a haunting. This was a message from the past, and he would not stop until he understood what the last bell truly meant.
The nights in Jamestown were growing colder. Autumn had painted the trees in copper and gold, and the wind carried the faint scent of the river, mixed with something else, something faintly metallic, like old iron. Eleanor stood outside the church ruins, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The moonlight spilled across the stone floor where the bell tower once rose, and somewhere, far in the air, the bell chimed. It was softer now, almost like it was drifting away. But she knew, she felt, that this was not a farewell. It was a warning. The next morning, she and Thomas searched through an old storeroom in the governor's abandoned quarters. The place smelled of mildew and dust. Wooden crates lay collapsed in the corners, their nails rusted. Rats scurried through the shadows. Thomas pried open a chest, and inside they found a rolled piece of parchment tied with frayed ribbon. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it. It was a church ledger, and in the margins, written in faded ink, someone had scribbled, "The bell tolls for those who have yet to answer." That night, the air in Jamestown felt different, thicker. Even the crickets were silent. When the bell rang, it sounded heavier, as though each strike carried the weight of a century. Eleanor stood frozen, staring toward the tower ruins. But this time, she saw movement, a flicker of a figure in the moonlight, standing where no living soul had stood for years. The figure's head was bowed, as if in prayer. Thomas whispered, "Do you see it too?" She nodded, her heart pounding. They stepped closer, and with each step, the bell's echo seemed to sink deeper into their bones. When they reached the threshold of the ruins, the figure looked up. It was a man, pale as the moon, with eyes clouded by centuries. He opened his mouth, and though no sound came, Eleanor understood the words. "Find the last vow before winter ends." The next moment, the figure vanished. The bell's echo faded into the river mist. And Eleanor knew they weren't just uncovering a ghost story, they were stepping into the unfinished business of Jamestown's dead. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and salt from the James River. The moon, pale and distant, hung low, casting silvery light over the ruins of Jamestown. Margaret stood at the edge of the churchyard, her cloak damp from the rain, her heart still pounding from what she had seen the night before.
The bell. It had rung again, but this time it wasn't the slow, mournful toll she had grown used to. This time it had been urgent, faster, louder, almost desperate. She had stood frozen, staring at the belfry, the ropes swaying on their own, no figure in sight. By morning, the villagers whispered more than usual. Even those who had dismissed the old stories now kept glancing at the church with wary eyes. Margaret knew she couldn't wait any longer. That afternoon, she went to the small library in the old council house, a place most people avoided. The air was stale, thick with the dust of centuries. Wooden shelves sagged under the weight of books and ledgers, their spines faded, their pages brittle. She searched for hours. Old shipping logs, parish records, weather journals. Then, tucked inside a cracked leather binding, she found it. A handwritten account dated 1623. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. The bell shall toll for the lost, and the lost shall answer. The entry spoke of a night long ago when Jamestown was under siege, its people starving, sickness spreading. The minister had rung the bell to summon aid from the river, but help never came. It was said that the last night it rang, no living man touched the rope. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the last line. When the living cannot, the dead will. Her mind reeled. Was the bell not a warning, but a call? And if so, who or what was it summoning? She stepped outside, the evening light fading into a blue-gray haze. Across the square, the church stood silent, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. That night, she didn't wait for the sound. She went to the church before the moon rose, the old wooden doors creaking as she pushed them open. The interior smelled of damp stone and candle wax long extinguished. Shadows gathered in the corners like waiting figures. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the bell rope. She placed a hand on it. It was cold, far colder than the air around her. And then, a whisper. So close to her ear, she could feel the breath. Help us. The rope jerked in her hand. Margaret gasped but did not let go. The bell began to move above her, the metal groaning before the deep, resonant toll filled the church, rolling out into the night. She felt it vibrate through her bones. Outside, something stirred. Something more than wind, more than water. She turned toward the doorway, and in the moonlight spilling through the open door, shapes began to appear. Figures, pale, silent, eyes fixed on her, and every one of them was wearing the clothing of Jamestown's first settlers. The night was colder than any Henry had felt in years. The wind from the James River carried a sharp bite, whispering through the empty streets of Jamestown. The moonlight painted the crumbling walls silver, and in the distance, the bell began to toll. Slow, heavy, echoing. Henry walked toward the sound, his footsteps crunching softly over the frost-covered ground. The abandoned church loomed ahead, its wooden door swaying open just enough for the darkness inside to spill out. The bell rope hung from the ceiling, swaying as if moved by unseen hands. "Who's there?" Henry called gently, his voice calm but carrying a strange weight. No answer came. He stepped inside. The air was thick, like walking into a memory. Shadows clung to the old pews, and in the dim light, he saw her. A woman in a simple 17th century dress, her face pale, her eyes filled with something between sorrow and hope. She was ringing the bell slowly, each toll echoing into the night. Henry's breath caught. He knew her. Though he had never met her, he recognized her from the old portraits in the historical archives. Elizabeth Carter, the last woman recorded in Jamestown before the final evacuation. Her lips moved, though no sound reached his ears. She mouthed the words again, and Henry realized she was praying. The bell stopped. She turned to him, her voice now faint but clear. "It must ring until the lost are found." Before he could speak, she faded, her figure dissolving into the cold air like mist under sunlight. The silence after her departure was almost unbearable. But then, from far beyond the settlement, another bell answered. Henry walked outside, his heart beating slower, calmer. The wind carried the sound of that distant bell, faint yet certain. Somewhere, perhaps across the river or deep in the marshes, another soul was still keeping the watch. And so, every night after, Henry returned to the old church. The bell always tolled at midnight, sometimes by unseen hands, sometimes by his own. Jamestown remained silent, but not forgotten.